So, you wanted to hear somebody ramble about a remake that hasn't even been confirmed yet? Well, you came to the right place. My name is Landon, also known as Player Out, but you can use whichever you like. Anyways, I wanted to talk about some ideas when it comes to a possible Final Fantasy IX remake. But you may ask, why? We're getting Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Remake Part 2 next year. Final Fantasy 9 Remake doesn't even exist yet. And to that I say, I'm early to the party. At least when it comes to actually talking about the game. Also, I just really like the original game a lot. I really want the remake to be real. So I thought the best way to get people more interested and to think about what the game could possibly be like was to speculate on what the game could look like from the graphics all the way to the combat. When it comes to the graphics, I think it's kind of obvious. I'd want it to look like, if not better, than Final Fantasy VII Remake. The game just looks so polished with the animations, characters, the whole game just looks impressive. So imagine how much they could improve on that by using the same engine and assets they could possibly use to make a Final Fantasy IX Remake look as good as possible. I could just imagine going through Alexandria for the first time and walking through the town with more depth and detail than before. And seeing the characters through a new lens would be cool to see as well. I think in terms of the level design and world design, going off of what I said before with the graphics, I think it should borrow from Final Fantasy VII Remake, but take a different path in terms of the level design. I think where Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1 lacked the most was the level design. It looks cool, but it is very linear in terms of progression, and to me personally, I could feel how you were on a set path, which isn't a bad thing if you're trying to tell a really good story. I just ask for a little room to breathe is all. I would want Final Fantasy IX Remake to be a little more open when it comes to its level and world progression, since the game doesn't take that long to open up more as you start going through the world. And to me, when you start the game and start running around as Vivi, the game is just begging for the city of Alexandria to be open and inviting, while also allowing to have many cracks and crevices to find and traverse. Just a more expanded, open environment is all I'd ask for. When it comes to Alexandria Castle and the Dark Woods and other places like that, I'd say to keep them linear as much as possible, since they're supposed to be linear to progress through the story, but maybe open up more stuff later on to give areas like them more depth and stuff to find and look at, since later on, places like Alexandria Castle do open up. It would be cool to just explore more areas and places that we've already been in and kind of already know like the back of our hand from the original game, and just see how they would expand upon them and change them up. In terms of the combat, there are two ways Square could handle it. One is keeping faithful to the original game and keeping the original battle system and tweaking it to make it more interesting and fresh, while also keeping it as accessible as the original game. I wouldn't know how they'd change up the original battle system, but knowing Square, they'd probably find some way to make the original system better. As for the other option, they could also keep going the Final Fantasy VII Remake route and using the same battle system, yet change it up and adapt it to make it work with Final Fantasy IX's original battle system mechanics, like trance and various armor, weapons, and accessories having the abilities that those characters can learn, as long as the ability is applicable to those characters. I'd also say a good way to adapt the combat is to make it a little faster and action-oriented, instead of putting a focus on commands like Final Fantasy VII Remake's battle system is. There's a balance that I think would need to be reached in order to make the combat even more enjoyable than Final Fantasy VII Remake. Not saying that Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat is bad and too slow. There are just instances where I feel like I could react if the characters were a little faster, that's all. Maybe a good way to adapt it would be to take a page out of Kingdom Hearts book and have spells and abilities linked to shortcuts, and maybe tying the trance system into this and having certain moves set to a shortcut, so you won't have to pull up a battle menu and find the move while everything moves in slow-mo. Though I think it would be made as an addition to the battle system and not remove the slow-mo battle menus, so that there would be room for all the different types of players. Like for the fast-paced players that like to really get into the action and not have to think too much about it, and also those who like to be strategic about it and take their time analyzing the battle and trying to figure out the best course of action. As for expanding on side quests and a bunch of extra content in the game, there's a bunch of potential for a bunch of new stuff to be added in, and also expanding upon the older side quests and content and stuff. Take for instance, like the Magnet side quest. It could be expanded upon much further, where you might be more involved in keeping up with the different Moogles throughout the world and making sure they're all in contact with each other while you figure out why the Magnet has been down for weeks or so. Along with like the friendly monster side quests and how you interact with them. Maybe it'll be harder to find them or harder to also just win them over, so it would require more effort and you can get a greater reward out of it than the original game. Also, the Chocobo side quest could have more stuff to find in the Grottos, along with expanding on how you level up your Chocobo and how to find the other Grottos. Even on the somewhat present crafting system, where you could combine different kinds of weapons, armor, and items to be able to make even better and more useful stuff. I've also come up with some ideas based on the original game for some newer side quests. Basic ones like monster hunting and item searching quests that could add more life to the towns and stuff in the game. They can't always be safe from danger, I'd assume, so I'd think they could have some kind of bulletin board full of odd jobs. The concept is pretty basic, but I think it could fit pretty well for a Final Fantasy IX Remake. As for another one, acting. Anyone who's played the original game remembers the plays at the start and the end of the game where the characters perform a play known as I Want to Be Your Canary in Alexandria. Even at the beginning, we had a playable segment where Zidane and Blank act out a duel as two of the characters in the play. So imagine if there could be a side quest where you acted out plays across the world as you travel from place to place, whether that be like indoor theater, outdoor theater, etc. This could be useful to get more gil, items, you name it. I could see a lot of potential for this with using spells for like special effects and stuff like that, to maybe even boosting the character stats, if the developers would want to even go that far. For stuff like this, I could probably think of a ton more stuff they could possibly expand upon, but as for now, this is all I can think of at the moment. I have a few ideas of how they could retell the story. First of which would be to not change too much about it, the original story, and how it progresses, and keep it the same as the original source material. But as for me, I want to get a little spicy when it comes to how they could adapt and expand on the story. My second idea of how they could retell the story is having a prologue to the story where we understand more about what kicked off the events of the original game, like seeing how the guild, Tantalus and in turn Zidane, were recruited to go and bring Princess Garnet to Lindblum. Maybe some of Vivi's backstory on how he got to Alexandria and how he got the fake ticket. Or like what happens after the main story. For instance, how Zidane and Garnet's relationship develops after the ending of the game, to how are Alexandria's relations to other governing powers in the world. Anyways, I think adding a prologue and epilogue would add a good bit more to the story and flesh out the world and characters a bit more. In terms of how long the game will be, I'd have to assume that they would do the same as Final Fantasy VII Remake and make it into multiple parts instead of one game. There's just so many concepts and places in this game that they could expand upon if they put in the time to do it. And as someone who adores this game, I wouldn't want it to just be a basic rehash of the original story, and would want to see the world reinvigorated by new in-depth world building, like adding more runes and stuff to collect in the world, and adding more lore to items like the Chocobo tablets, Excalibur 2, etc. And to the characters like Baku and Tantalus, Amarant, Aiko, Lani, to even the bosses like Ozma and even Hades himself. There's just a lot they could pack into a Final Fantasy IX Remake if they decided to go the same route that Final Fantasy VII Remake did, and I'd be all the happier for it. In summary, I think there's a lot of potential for Final Fantasy IX Remake to be amazing, and personally, if they decided to make it, I'd want it to be the definitive way to experience this story, world, characters, and I'd say I've laid out my opinions on how it could be done out to the best of my ability. But I'd like to know what you guys think about this topic. What would you want to see out of a Final Fantasy IX Remake? What would you want the devs to expand upon and explore? And if you thought there are some things that I didn't elaborate on enough, or didn't or did agree with, I want to hear what people say. As for now, this is the end of my discussion. Hope you guys enjoyed it and would appreciate it if you liked it. If you did, subscribe if you wanted to see more of my content, and if you could share the video around to get more people in on the conversation. Anyways, I'll be seeing you all later.